Chap, I've reached a decision. Will the parties please rise? Chelsea Russell eased back her chair and rose to her feet, scrutinizing the white-haired judge who held her niece's fate in his hands. She didn't dare look at her mother and father seated to her left. She could barely face their lies and manipulations. For the first time in her life, Chelsea wanted to lose the case. Representing her parents had been a foolish undertaking made under stressful, grief-filled circumstances. The untimely loss of her sister had been raw, the guilt for things not done, acute. Having grown up in their home, she should have known her mother and father weren't cut out to be role models to a young child. The judge cleared his throat. Rendering a decision between family is never easy. He turned towards Griffin Stewart, a man Chelsea had wronged in ways she'd never intended. You lost a brother in that car accident, the judge said. Griffin nodded. Chelsea swallowed over the lump in her throat. With his dark hair and strong features, the resemblance to her niece was unmistakable. So was his devotion. His earlier testimony proved his suffering ran deep. She clutched the edges of the scarred wooden table. The judge turned towards Chelsea's parents. And you lost a daughter, he said with compassion. Your desire to raise your granddaughter is understandable. Admirable even, but not at someone else's expense. Chelsea agreed. She hadn't known her parents would breach the boundaries of fairness to obtain what they wanted. She only wished she had known. They all would have been spared this ordeal. The judge continued. No one benefits by lying and deceit. Nor will it gain you the result you seek. As a result, I hereby award full and permanent custody to the child's uncle, Griffin Stewart, with liberal visitation rights granted to the Russells, who I hope have learned from this experience. He banged his gavel. Court is adjourned. It was over. Chelsea laid her head in her hands as her parents stormed out of the room without a word. Alone in the hallway, Chelsea leaned against the marble pillar and closed her eyes. Through her light silk blouse, the cold stone chilled her back and she shivered. Despite her relief over the outcome, common decency and her feelings for Griffin Stewart mandated she attempt to make amends. She wondered if he'd even listen. Having avoided family functions, Chelsea's dealings with Griffin had been limited to professional affairs. They would pass one another at bar-related functions with a friendly nod and an occasional exchange of pleasantries. At times, she even thought she'd been the recipient of a lingering look, but knew she had to be mistaken. Or perhaps she'd just wanted to be. Though she'd given him an admiring glance of her own, her chosen lifestyle left no room for any man, especially one whose ties to her family drew her into an emotional minefield. And now, they'd have to be civil for Alex's sake. Thanks to the judge's ruling, Griff couldn't deny her or her parents' visitation, but she no longer expected him to greet her with an easy smile or a casual laugh. His reputation labeled him as a formidable attorney with a quick temper which he'd probably turn her way, given half a chance. Tough morning. Chelsea recognized that deep voice. Apparently, the endless day wasn't over yet. More than you can imagine, she said as she lifted her gaze. Hazel eyes blazed with unspoken anger and his blatant disgust charged the air around him. She remembered a time when those eyes had gazed upon her with friendly warmth. Looking at him now, aloof, distant, and treating her with disdain, she regretted the change. But she met the challenge without blinking. She understood Griffin's contempt and wouldn't begrudge him his pain. She'd lost a sister. He'd barely gotten over the shock of losing his brother when she'd served him with custody papers. She'd nearly cost him his niece, the only family he had left, and Chelsea knew that pain firsthand. She was intimately familiar with losing someone precious. Don't tell me. It's always difficult to lose a case, he said with undisguised hostility. She shook her head. Not this time. Really. I owe you an apology. Save the I'm sorries for someone who cares. You did your job and you lost. Just be thankful you did, or who knows what kind of life my niece would have had. She's my niece, too. A lot of good that almost did her." She winced because he was right. Because her parents had lost their daughter, Chelsea had succumbed to her mother's tears and her father's pleas, believing the couple would put their granddaughter first, before their active social life and status in the community. An orphaned little girl deserved more stability than one parent or guardian could offer. Chelsea had foregone fighting for custody herself because her single-parent home wasn't the best choice for her niece, nor was Griffin's. At least her parents could afford to care for the little girl, and Chelsea had planned on her own influence to compensate for her parents' shortcomings. Lying, cheating, and attempted bribery. They'd gone overboard this time. She shivered in disgust given the choice between the carefree bachelor and her materialistic parents. She'd gambled on hope and her parents, and lost. She shifted her attention to the man to whom she owed more than an apology. "You have every right to be angry, but I'm glad you won." Chelsea placed a hand on his arm. Searing heat and an unexpected jolt of awareness penetrated her fingertips. Warmth suffused her, awakening long-dormant feelings. She shook her head, amazed a mere touch could ignite a flame so strong it threatened to consume her. Though she forced her hand to remain on his muscled forearm, his heated strength settled inside her and shattered what little composure remained. "I'm sure you'll make a great father," she said, her words sounding hoarse to her ears. "Uncle." She had a father. She knew that without his curt reminder. Though she and her sister had drifted apart over the years, Chelsea still felt the loss. Griffin and his brother had been each other's only family. She couldn't begin to imagine his pain. The last few weeks had shown her that he and Alex were as close as parent and child. He'd obviously spent more time with the little girl than Chelsea ever had. At one time, she believed she'd had good reason to back away. She couldn't be that selfish again. Without warning, he jerked his arm back as if her touch repelled him. She curled her empty fingers into a fist. Obviously, she'd been the only one to feel a powerful connection. She wouldn't allow him to know he'd shaken her. "Look, I'm sure raising a child won't be easy," she began. "I can handle it." He folded his arms across his chest. Her eyes followed the movement. He'd removed his suit jacket earlier. His paisley tie hung loose around his neck, and the first few buttons on his starched white shirt had been opened, revealing deeply bronzed skin. He cleared his throat. She glanced up to find his intense eyes focused on hers. His gaze traveled the length of her body before finally settling once again on her now flushed face. But the effect of his heated gaze remained, evidenced by the tingling of her skin and the heaviness in her breasts. An appreciative glint sparkled in the depths of his dark eyes. She had little time to ponder his reaction or her own surprising feelings. An instant later, the steely anger returned. "Alex and I will be fine," he said in an abrupt voice, reminding her of all that lay between them. Chelsea swallowed hard. "I didn't mean to imply otherwise. I just wanted to offer. I mean, if you should need help or anything," she faltered. "We won't." The chill in the air had nothing to do with the air conditioning. His cold stare told her in no uncertain terms that anything that passed between them had been one-sided or existed only in her imagination. Her overture had not been welcome. She sighed and thought of her niece. Though she had hoped to change his mind, she merely nodded her understanding. "Look who Uncle Ryan has here!" A deep voice interrupted them. Grateful for the temporary reprieve, she shifted her gaze. Alex bobbed up and down on the shoulders of a dark-haired man who had occasionally sat behind Griffin in the courtroom, a man who seemed as close to Griffin and Alex as any family member. Griffin reached over, lifted his niece from Ryan's arms, and held her close. Without warning, he tossed the 2-year-old high, repeating the tickling episode Chelsea had seen many times that morning. The happy shrieks warmed her as nothing else could. At least her niece would have a happy life. Seeing the smile on his face, Chelsea realized Griffin was a devastatingly handsome man. Coupled with his ability to put aside his grief for the sake of a child, Chelsea had learned much about him. She softened towards him once again. Settled in her uncle's arms, Alex reached out a hand and touched Chelsea's hair. "Pretty." "So are you," Chelsea said, ruffling the child's dark curls with her fingers. "Mommy." At the little girl's heartfelt plea, pain seared Chelsea's heart and she withdrew her hand. In truth, she had lost her sister long ago. Because Shannon's family had represented the kind of life Chelsea wanted but would always be denied, she'd made the difficult decision to pull back from the closeness the sisters had always shared. Chelsea had suffered through an abusive marriage for too long, a mistake that had robbed her of the ability to have children, a family, a future. Wanting her younger sister to have all she couldn't, she had watched from the sidelines, assuring herself that Shannon's marriage wouldn't sour as her own had. That her sister remained happy and loved. After a while, Chelsea had stayed away, remaining connected to her sister only by phone. Death had made the rift permanent. "Want Mommy?" Alex said, holding her hands out towards Chelsea. "No, sweetie, I'm not Mommy." She ignored the memories the statement brought and forcefully pushed aside the unwelcome reminders of what would never be. "Hold me." The little girl threw her body forward. Griffin had no choice but to release her, Chelsea no choice but to take the child into her arms and hold her close. Ignoring his grim expression, Chelsea planted a kiss on Alex's forehead. The sweet aroma of baby shampoo tickled Chelsea's nose, reminding her of why she'd always tried to keep a safe distance from this adorable child. In Alex, Chelsea saw too clearly the baby she'd lost and the children she'd never have. She closed her eyes and inhaled, savoring the unfamiliar yet comforting smell. "Mommy," the child said, looking around. Chelsea swallowed, forcing back the pain that lurked behind the unwelcome tears. "No, honey," she said again in a husky voice. Griffin exhaled a sigh and reached for Alex. Reluctantly, Chelsea handed the little girl back to her uncle. As she returned Alex to Griffin, the empty feeling in the pit of her stomach proved she'd been right. Any connection to this little girl would come at great emotional cost. Thanks to the jarring shift in family dynamics and the painful loss of her sister, Chelsea had no choice. Obviously, Alex needed a connection to her mother. That was the least Chelsea could offer her sister's child. The little girl needed her, and she would reach out to Alex regardless of the emotional risk. She met Griffin's gaze and was startled to find his eyes trained on her face. "I guess you look more like Shannon than I realized," he said finally, shifting Alex in his arms. "She asks for Mommy and Daddy constantly." As he spoke, he took 2 steps back. He obviously begrudged her even a simple explanation. Chelsea bit back a sigh. As a lawyer, she should be used to uphill battles, but he seemed determined to hold more than a grudge. Despite her reservations, she'd like more time with her niece in the future. The judge's ruling had assured her of that, but she realized now wasn't the time to ask. "It'll get easier." She cringed as the platitude escaped her lips. He remained silent. The other man stood to one side and watched them with obvious interest. Chelsea felt the heat of his gaze and looked over. He smiled and pulled his hand from the pocket of his jeans. "Ryan Jackson?" She grasped his hand, grateful for a friendly face in the enemy camp. "Chelsea Russell. Nice to meet you." At the exchange of pleasantries, Griffin's gaze settled on their intertwined fingers and his expression darkened. She picked up her briefcase. "As I said, I'm sorry. If there's anything I can do." "There's not." He didn't bother to couch his anger with niceties. She sympathized with his pain, but did not have to take his abuse. "Right." She reached out to Alex, fingering her soft curls between her fingers. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the building, away from the man and the child. Griff scowled at Chelsea's retreating back, his gaze unwillingly fixed on the gentle sway of her hips as she walked. He grunted in disgust. There was nothing gentle about Chelsea Russell. He placed Alex beside him on the floor. That he'd almost allowed himself to be distracted by Chelsea's dark eyes and huskily spoken words disgusted him. He couldn't let himself forget her attempt to separate him from his niece, a little girl she'd never given a second thought to until now. Chelsea had never been one for family visits, and though he'd have liked to get to know her better, he hadn't been given the chance. He'd always admired her looks, and as an attorney, he'd respected her dedication and zeal, but he'd never expected her to turn those killer instincts on him. Thanks to her misplaced family loyalty, he'd almost lost his niece, his last link to his brother. For that, he'd never forgive her. Cool off, buddy. You won. Alex is safe and she's yours. Yeah. Thanks for the surveillance tape, by the way. Proof that Chelsea's parents had attempted to bribe Griff into relinquishing custody had undermined every seemingly credible witness on their behalf and undoubtedly swayed the judge. What's a good PI for? Griff turned to watch Alex run in circles around the marble pillar. She looked so much like Jared that a lump formed in his throat. Once it lodged there, the accompanying emotional pain and memories would take time to subside. The car accident that claimed the lives of his brother and sister-in-law had shaken the foundation of his existence. He and Alex had each other and no one else. The Russells didn't count, and for all the time she'd spent with the little girl, neither did Chelsea. At 2 years old, Alex needed Griff to keep the memory of both parents alive in her heart and her mind. He would do that, even if he had to alter his entire lifestyle to accomplish it. Why do you suppose she takes on all those tough cases? Ryan asked. He pulled a carrot from a paper bag and placed it in Alex's hand. More than half of them are pro bono, you know. This doesn't count as one of her tough cases, Griff muttered. And her parents don't exactly classify as those in need of free legal counsel. How do you know all this, anyway? Had to do something with my time while I kept Alex away from the theatrics in there. He gestured towards the courtroom. Who the hell knows why women do what they do? Most of them want something. Griff could understand Chelsea's need to support family. He'd stuck by his brother all their lives. But a bright woman with an ounce of compassion would want more for her niece than to be raised by people capable of deceit and bribery. Even if they were her parents. Chelsea Russell's not Deidre? Griff lifted one eyebrow. No? Could have fooled me. She does a damned good imitation. She's out to build a reputation and doesn't care who she steps on in the process. His gaze drifted towards the glass doors. Chelsea had disappeared minutes before. Trust me, Ryan. She'll get what she wants. I know the type. Maybe she's building that reputation, but seems to me it's the other way around. Unlike some women, she gives. Doesn't take. Sure she does. You're just a sucker for a pretty face. Still bitter, huh? I guess it hasn't been that long, but I'd say you're better off without the witch. Drop it, Jackson. His fiancée hadn't had the decency to wait until Griff had buried his brother before she dumped him, his new charge, and a lifestyle that didn't fit into her plans. She'd turned out to be no better than the mother who had abandoned him as a child. Without a six-figure salary, Griff held little appeal. Deidre had stuck around only as long as he remained a partner at the largest firm in the city of Boston. What's all this hostility about anyway? The lady was just doing her job, Ryan said. A job that no self-respecting attorney would have taken. But hey, representing her parents must have garnered her some pretty wealthy clients. Who cared if her own niece suffered in the process? Not Chelsea Russell. She'd proven her priorities. Morals and ethics weren't among them. He didn't ask himself why he cared so damned much that she disappointed him. The old folks did a number on her, couldn't you see that? Besides, somebody had to take their case. Everyone is entitled to legal representation. Isn't that the first thing they teach you in law school? Griff mumbled an expletive and caught Alex by the back of her shirt. Hold it, squirt. The child stilled for all of 2 seconds before she took off to circle the pillar again. At least she'd stopped long enough to hand him the carrot and put 2 orange handprints on his white shirt. Tell me something, Ryan said, in his I know something even you don't tone of voice. What's really bothering you? The fact that the Russells dragged you through a dirty court battle, or that the lovely Miss Russell played opposing counsel? Griff cocked an eyebrow at Ryan. What the hell do you think? I just spent the day fighting for custody of my brother's child, he said in a hushed yet angry voice. His niece was young, but bright. Griff didn't want her to remember any more of this awful day than was necessary. I'd be furious no matter who tried to take Alex away from me. Right. Chelsea has nothing to do with this, Griff said in response to Ryan's disbelieving stare. Then why did thoughts of dark eyes and soft-looking skin remain embedded in his mind? And why did her heated touch course through his clothing to reach somewhere inside him he'd closed off long ago? Ryan shrugged. You're the boss. If you're sure you're not interested, I just might be. Griff grunted in disgust. I'd bet she's not the dirty jeans and sneakers type. Low blow for someone who isn't interested. Shut up and let's get out of here. Mommy, Alex said. Griff shook his head. Mommy, she wailed. Oh, hell, Griff mumbled as he took her little hand and walked to the door. Asterisk. Griff popped the trunk of the family-style sedan and collected as many grocery bags as he could carry. After 3 trips to the house and back, he'd unloaded most of the packages. He marveled at the amount of food and other items necessary to care for a 2-year-old. Since his niece had become a permanent part of his life, his purchases had expanded immensely. Diapers were but one new addition. After lifting the last bag, he slammed the trunk closed. Alex's appetite amazed him. So did the fact that he'd traded in his beloved convertible for what the salesman had termed the ultimate family car. Griff had nearly choked on the word family. That was before the man had slapped him on the back and cracked, must have been one hell of an argument. This baby's a lot more expensive than flowers or candy. Griff grimaced at the memory. His sports car hadn't netted much as a trade-in. The guy was a crook, taking Griff's convertible for much less than what he'd paid. Still, he had to admit the man's views on women were sound. At this moment, Griff didn't have a hell of a lot of respect for the gender. He and Alex were a family. There wasn't a chance the twosome would turn into 3. He left the packages on the kitchen counter and went to trade places with Mrs. Baxter. After a day with an active 2-year-old, the older woman probably needed a rest, unless the past few weeks of sleepless nights had finally caught up with Alex and she'd taken a nap. The poor little girl could use the sleep. So, for that matter, could he? He was physically exhausted and emotionally drained. His life as a bachelor had left him ill-equipped to handle his niece and her night terrors, or whatever demons prevented the child from sleeping soundly. The sliding glass door in the kitchen led to a grassy backyard. Griff followed the sound of Alex's giggles to the large willow tree located on the side of the property. Her carefree laughter surprised him. Though she'd taken to Mrs. Baxter, Alex remained reserved around the older woman. Griff's concern was diminished somewhat by the fact that his office was now located in the upstairs level of his 2-family house. He'd open his practice next week. Should a problem arise, Alex would rarely be far from his sight. Childlike laughter echoed in the air and Griff smiled. For once, life seemed to be looking up. He turned the corner of the house and stared. Alex sat cuddled in Chelsea Russell's lap. Chelsea's brown hair ruffled in the breeze and she looked down, struggling to keep the light wind from turning the pages of a book. That Alex's little fingers kept grabbing pages made the task more difficult. More. His niece's voice drifted towards him. He stepped closer, mesmerized by the image of the woman reading to Alex, the little girl who had become the center of his being. With their heads bent forward, dark curls ruffled by the wind, they looked so alike they could have been mother and daughter. Alex laughed, happier than any time in Griff's recent memory. As he'd seen the last time they were together, something about Chelsea struck a chord in his niece. Whether it was Chelsea's resemblance to her sister or something more, Chelsea reached Alex where others could not. Watching them together, Griff silently acknowledged that this woman affected him, as well. He remained quiet and listened to her soft voice. He searched his mind for similar images in his past, but none came. When his mother had taken off in search of a better, wealthier lifestyle, the task of raising Jared had fallen to Griff. His father tried, but juggling fatherhood and a full-time job had been difficult. As a child, Griff had been denied the uncomplicated pleasure of having a story read to him. When his little brother had gotten scared or lonely, Griff had made up exaggerated tales to distract him. No one had been there for Griff then. For the moment, he let Chelsea's voice surround him. Absorbed in her tale, he allowed himself to pretend life could be different, that he could indulge in both love and trust without having them thrown back in his face. The end. Chelsea shut the book. Eyes closed, she lifted her face towards the sun. A peaceful expression touched her features, making her appear vulnerable. Soft and approachable, he thought. Almost as she had after the hearing, when she tried to apologize. Reality intruded, unbidden and unwelcome. Griff forced himself to recall why he'd never have such a loving family scene in his own home. The pleasant feelings she invoked disappeared, along with his good mood. How could he have allowed himself to feel anything for Chelsea Russell? Having fun. Careful not to upset Alex, he kept his voice neutral. Chelsea's gaze met his. He couldn't decipher the look in her eyes, though. He'd like to think it was guilt. I was just reading Alex the story. So I see. Butterfly, Alex said, tossing the book towards him. Griff knelt down and caught Alex as she flew into his arms. He chuckled at her wide smile and grass-stained knees. "Where's Mrs. Baxter?" he asked, looking over the little girl's head. "When I got here, she had a headache. I offered to watch Alex for a while." Chelsea stood and wiped dirt and grass off her jeans, her long fingers brushing against the faded denim. The material molded to her slender legs he could envision wrapped around him in a much more intimate setting. He muttered a curse and tore his gaze away from temptation, setting Alex down beside him. "Come with me, Sword. I think there's milk and cookies in the kitchen." Confrontation could wait until he sidetracked his niece. The little girl let out a squeal of delight and took off across the lawn. "I'll be back after I find Mrs. Baxter and get Alex settled." Without waiting for an answer, Griff turned and caught up with Alex. His gut instinct told him Chelsea would still be there when he got back. He and Chelsea obviously had things to settle between them. Why else would she have come?